Get ready, 'cause here I come. Gonna move the mountain, gonna touch the sky, stand in the middle of a hurricane, looking right in the eye. Ain't nothing gonna hold me down. Get ready, 'cause here I come.
I guess it always starts with the functionality. My goal is that what I create should be for many people. In general, I'm quite fascinated by earthen colors, and actually there are more colors in nature than you would actually believe, sometimes really powerful colors. If you see this color tableau for the almond, it's not so that one item is the exact same color as we ended up using, but it's like a soup of colors. It's crucial that you can recognize yourself in the product you did, like looking yourself in the mirror. Doing these tableaus is also, that's a treat for me. I love doing those, so it's also something I treasure doing. It's fun.
Welcome, SAIA members and friends of SAIAshare, especially those who are attending for the first time. As you know by now, SAIAshare, an initiative of the SAIA Practice Committee, is held on the first Friday of every month. My name is Eugene Barnard, and I'm your host this afternoon. We would like to introduce you to Angelique Pillay from Duravit. Our kind sponsors, welcome Angelique, and thank you very much for your sponsorship. We look forward to learning a bit more about your well-known company and the products that you render. And then thanks to Corina Gibson from ECPD. Corina, you are also indispensable, and thank you for steering the ship as usual. We have another two very exciting presentations for you this afternoon. I will still introduce you to Kevin Lloyd, who's going to be dealing with session 2. And Kevin is going to be unlocking the challenges and the potential of doing work in estates, something I believe most of us have been involved with in the past. But first of all, in session 1, we will be listening to Colin Scott telling us all about the brand new SAIA Client Architect Agreement. Now, Colin and his team have been working very hard over the past few years for the benefit of SAIA members and the profession at large. The agreement will become a crucial asset in your arsenal of documents that is bound to make practicing not only easier for you, but also safer. Right, Colin Scott was a senior associate at Build Architects, previously Berg Doherty and Partners, Berg Doherty Bryant and Partners, one of the oldest practices in South Africa. And he was involved not beginning back, but also in the Lost City project many years ago, and twice now on the Menlyn Park or Menlyn Shopping Centre, first in the late 1990s, and then again in the not too long ago. So he's done the same project twice. He is the chair of the practice committee for the Pretoria Institute of Architects, the PIA, and he serves on SAIA's National Practice Committee, and he's SAIA's representative on the PROXA committee that deals with service level agreements, professional service level agreements. He deals extensively with procurement and tender related issues. And a recent focus of his work has been on the need to tighten up the terms of appointments of architects, and in these new modern times, particularly with regard to BIM projects. So we look forward to that aspect that has been added to the client architect agreement. Colin, as I said to you previously, we look very forward to what you have to offer. We invite everyone who's joined us thus far to listen to you with interest. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, glad to be here as ever, but very interesting to note that they say New York, New York. So good they named it twice. Maybe it should be Menlyn, Menlyn. So good they named it twice, or built it twice. Anyway, welcome everybody. I'm going to be delving into the new client architect agreement. that is just being launched now, and looking at it from the point of view of the need for consensus agreements and the need for an agreement and its importance. Looking at the basic structure of the client architect agreement and how it works and what is contained within it, as well as the appendices that form part of that agreement. And then, as Eugene mentioned, touch briefly on the aspects of BIM that tie into the new agreement and what is upcoming in the near future with that. And then quickly wrapping up with a quick demonstration of how you can log in and get hold of the document and use it on your projects. So without further ado, because we've got to fit a liter into a beaker, as it were, let's look at consensus agreements and the need for them. Now, often you may kind of ask and wonder, what is the difference between a consensus agreement and a sort of majority? Really, the consensus is it's an agreement or between parties that through judgment, discourse, and agreement, they form an opinion that is reached and agreed to by the group as a whole. It's never a case that you end up with one or two or three people not agreeing to something. Now, as I say, it's that decision by all members of the group and not just a selection of the group. Now, in the past, there are various forms of appointment for architects that have been in our consensus agreements. There's obviously been the past one from SAIA over the years since 2008. There is one that has been produced by SACAP, and also institutes like SAIAT also have their own document as a consensus agreement for use with clients, but each one has its own strengths. Now, the reasons you should use them: it fulfills the responsibility of the codes of conduct. It actually establishes that proper business agreement with your client. We often forget that we are in business with our client, and it is a relationship, financial and business, with a client. And it establishes the actual authority between yourself and the client, that you can act on the client's authority, which without, we can't do much of what we need to. And it provides that clarification for use if there's any disputes, or just clarification as a checklist of what you are providing. It's imperative also because of the lengthy term of many building contracts. You're not dealing with a product that you're selling. One day, next week you come and install it, and then your work is finished. You have that relationship with the client for a long time. It serves to comply with the requirements of the Consumer Protection Act. That's often something many of us forget about, is that everything we do with clients in selling our services and presenting ourselves for profit, we are covered by the Consumer Protection Act, and we have to make sure we conform with it. Also, submission of building plans to the various councils for approval. The client has to commit that he has appointed us as his agent to represent him. Law of agency, as you know, is a major aspect of the work of what we do. Our basis of appointment is based around the fact of law of agency, that we are an agent for the client, and we are performing juristic acts. We are performing legal acts that he should be doing, but we're doing it on his behalf. So we have a huge responsibility in that regard. And finally, PI insurers require us to have a balanced agreement with our clients that actually provides nothing more than law requires us to do. And if we step outside that line, there are consequences. Other than that, the reasons for using consensus agreements obviously is, as we all know, the various items of the SACAP Code of Professional Conduct that lists what we actually need to provide in the agreement. SAIA is a little bit more concise in that under Principle 2 of the rules, it is that we must not undertake professional work unless there hasn't been an agreement in writing to the terms and scope of the appointment, which is really a summary of what the SAIAshare code says. So let's move along to client architect agreement. As you know it was produced in 2008 and is along these sorts of lines. Small text, lots of information, and has been commented at times by people saying it is unwieldy, unreadable, difficult and irrelevant. Thus, over the years, there's been need to update it. So for the last sort of 3 years, we have been hard at work at that, and now we are launching the new agreement. The rationale behind the new agreement is that it is complementary to other consensus documents. The prime one being PROXA. PROXA is the suite of documents for individual consultants or consultants forming a team that has a commonality across agreements. The structure of which is more along the lines of larger projects in terms of team structures and complexity of projects. Whereas the SAIA document aims to be more attuned to the medium, the smaller projects that the majority of the SAIA members and practices undertake. So the positioning of the document is really that it's for appointment as an architect. Principal agency services are included, but it is optional. It includes the requirements of principal consultant as per the PROXA document, but that it isn't defined as principal consultant service. It is basically part of the architect's service, as we all know. And it is specifically for projects without a project manager appointed. Okay, the aim also was to have the wording concise and simple, more client-friendly, which was a complaint previously, and structured to have the information that is required up front. Unlike the existing one, which the first portions are the definitions and terms and conditions, there's not really a lot that clients can see up front. First portion is the scope of work. This is a brief description of the work that the services are applicable to, i.e. the building or portion of a building. There's a requirement to fill in a project description, which is a brief description to identify the basic requirements of the project. It is not the brief itself. Indicative timelines can be added, which lists specific deadlines and any requirements for that. The complexity rating has been added to tie into the current SAIAshare fee structure and the framework of the fees, and also there is tying that into the SANS 10400 as well, so you can classify the requirements there. There is also a portion that we will add in one of the next versions, which is the IDOW category, once the whole IDOW has been settled, and we are confident as SAIA that it can be used effectively. The services are not specifically in this document. They are listed under a separate appendix document, which I'll come to later. They can be altered, but they must be recorded in writing like anything. Otherwise, they have absolutely no standing. And also, you must remember that undertaking any work that isn't listed and defined applies additional liability and risk and responsibility to you that you're not getting paid for and you're not being covered for by your PI. Principal agency, as you say, is optional. It's the first portion of the document. It is ticked by default as being applicable. So in the document, if you're not acting as principal agent, you will untick it and the principal agency services will be scored out. BIM, as we said, is now included. The requirement upfront is to allocate whether it's being undertaken as a BIM project or not, and whether the information protocol is going to be issued at the beginning or the end. This activates different portions of the document and the schedule of services. The information protocol I'll come to later and give you an indication of what it is, because it is an item that will be coming soon. Professional fees, everything that we are about is to make money in many ways. So we need to define the basis of the fees, how those are based, and on what the understanding of that basis is. In the new documents, being an electronic version, there are certain instances where you can add additional requirements, this being an example of one in red. It appears in red on the final document, so it's identifiable. For project budget, an important question to ask, and it is an allocated tick box to confirm, is whether the budget the client is giving you includes or excludes the fees and expenses, which are either forgotten about by the client or forgotten to be taken off the budget if they are included. Payments, there's a whole section on payment, from the period of payment to the fact that the client cannot withhold and set off payment in any dispute, that it must be resolved as a separate issue. There are aspects for overdue invoice, the procedures for those, and one thing every practitioner must remember is you can actually suspend or reduce the rate of work if you're not paid timeously. And this is written into the document, so you have the backup if you do suspend your work. Also, the requirements of how you deal with disputed invoices. The agreement is effective from the date when the services start, which is either stated in the signed agreement. And the duration is until termination of the project, which is in effect completion of the services. The services do not finish actually until you have received full payment. So if full payment has not been received and there's a potential of dispute after completion and handover the building, the agreement still is in place, so you have legal backing until you get that payment. There is a long section on identification of the client's obligations, try to clarify and make them concise for a client to understand them. And also with the list there, it is easier to actually sit with the client and explain them at the beginning of the appointment. And as we said earlier, the importance of agency. You must make sure they understand that and they understand their requirement to provide reasonable time to undertake the work. You must remember items that are specific, like client responsibility, which are listed in here, that they are responsible for health and safety, the financial viability and insurances, not you. The client must get the right advice regarding insurances as to what's appropriate, for instance. There's also an aspect of the client's of the architect's obligations, what the client can expect from the architect, which then goes into responsibilities and liabilities based on the principle that a liability is a consequence of fulfilling a responsibility. First, you have responsibilities, and then the work and liability if you did something wrong. Limits of liability must be allocated. What you see here on the screen is the two bits in red. They can be changed from the typical 5 years, but within different sections of the document, you need to ensure that, for instance, where it's stated in the limits of liability, corresponding section in professional indemnity insurance is completed. Intellectual property is always one that is of concern. people saying, who has the copyright? The client says, well, I've paid for it, give me the drawings, I've got the copyright. It's not the case. The copyright is owned by the architect. This gets specifically important when you start tying in the BIM components of appointments. In that, all appointments, BIM and these, you're actually granting the license to the client to use the materials. The materials being the drawings, the specifications, the design, etc., to produce and build his project. And at the end, he's only allowed, in terms of this agreement, entitlement to a hard, uneditable or uneditable electronic copies. So if you're giving him DWGs and you have not handed over the copyright, protect those so that they are only read only. There's a section in tender documentation as to what happens if the tenders return to a higher budget or estimated value and how that is handled. There's clarification of how shop drawings and inspections are undertaken on site in terms of their consequences. There is a fully detailed section on suspension and termination, as well as the consequences of the termination and what you have to do and what the client has to do. There is an additional section that isn't on existing documents, is the clause of force majeure, in other words, an act of God, which defines that you are not in default if you're prevented from undertaking your work and providing the services. And there are requirements of what you must and mustn't do for notification of that event. And dispute resolution of the approach of talk about it first before you go to the court. The last portion on the first part of the agreement is the articles of agreement, which is basically the facts and figures, the schedule of the fees, the limits of your liability, etc., and the limits of what you're allowed to make in terms of changes financially, and the $64 million question, the signatures at the end. Now, the appendices to the agreement, currently they are 2 of them that are published. There is a 3rd on the way. The first one is Appendix A, which is the services. The current new document works slightly differently, being an electronic version. Under the work stages, you would select the stages of service that you are providing, and then in the schedule of services, the corresponding lines are scored out if you have not selected them as being applicable. Additionally, in the schedules, you'll see under standard services that there are codes that have been added to each service to make it identifiable to which items are principal agency services, which ones potentially are chargeable, actually are chargeable as an additional service, as well as items for the client to identify that he is required to put input and where he has to approve items. PROXA is a document that recently, or a couple of versions ago, introduced stage 0. We have up to a point followed the lead, but we are not calling it stage 0 because it's not a stage that attributes fee unless you change the agreement. We've called it project initiation. It's all the work you start in getting the risks and ideas down of what's required before you start negotiating with the client in terms of the brief and your scope of services. Services are split much as they have been in the same stages, but there are changes within them. Not just the schedule and the way it's presented here, in that each stage has defined headings that follow through each stage, but also in terms of some basic things here. For instance, there is design concept at the top, and down the bottom there is design preliminary under stage 2. There are differences, and we will identify those during various courses, webinars, and pieces of documentation as we launch the project. The intent of these is to make it more concise and readable as to what is actually required of you of an architect, as well as with the coding, as we said, for people to see what they have to do from a client aspect. It may seem more onerous because there are a lot more than the basic stacker view, but it is more a description and clarification of what has to be undertaken, not an increase in requirements and risks. As I said earlier, this is an example where there is no service applied and you have not selected it as being applicable. It scores out the service to make it abundantly clear those aspects of service you are not providing. At the end of the services of the agreement, there is a place to put in additional services. The one we have included as a defined additional services that is always there unless you delete it is the service of providing the applications to the authorities for deviation plan approval so that you can get the money for that scope. Appendix B deals with the fees. It is a detailed schedule that starts at the beginning from the foundations of the fee agreement. Again, a lot of selection tick boxes, whether it's a final project cost, time charges. There are other methodologies of calculating fees that have been included here based on the understanding now that we are not always doing final project cost nor based fully on SAIAshare guideline fees. There is also a section to list and identify the apportionment and the invoicing of fees. Important from the client aspect to see upfront what he has to pay when, because the worst thing he can have is by stage 3, he suddenly gets an invoice for a large sum and has not been aware of what it would be. He gets very upset. Also, recording of disbursements, the selection of the boxes, highlights and item on the right hand side to enter your quantum of fee for that. So it's a very active document. As we said, BIM protocols, it is now happening increasingly in the workplace, but there is very little understanding of the implications of it. This document you see here is actually the first draft, is going through the process of vetting and peer review. It is based and ties into the BIM, International BIM standard, ISO 19650, but is structured to be used by practitioners as part of a SAIA suite of documents where ISO 19650 standards are not actually being used. But it still allows and covers oneself for how BIM projects work. Now, to purchase this document, you would go to freshprojects.co.za, and when you're on the website, you go to the contracts button, access contracts. Then there's a login. This login is your Fresh Projects login if you already have a profile. If not, you would just set up a profile. It is free. There's no charge for that. You would fill in the details of the project. You would then select adding a contract document. There's CSIS documents there. They're also supported by Fresh Projects, but our new one is there, top left. Clicking on the button gives you more detail about the project, but then you can go to checkout, purchase your document. What you must remember as SAIA members is there is a discount applicable, so don't forget to apply your SAIA username and password that you have to access the members portal on the website. Then you can open your document and you can select which portions of the document you're going to complete. As you've seen previously, this is a highly interactive document. Certain parts are pre-populated. There are the Canada sections that can help. Now, where you can add or change clauses, on the right there's a little plus button where you can add a clause and a little pen if you want to edit a clause. They have been limited to the ones that are applicable, because you must be very careful you don't amend a contract unwittingly and cause more legal problems by inserting something you don't understand. Included with that then are obviously the methods of payment, fees, etc. Bespoke payments of fees, because you're not doing something standard. How disbursements are paid, what the disbursements are. I love chocolate, so the chocolate factory tool, it suits me fine. Once you have ticked the save button, you can then go to click the draft button, generate your draft, print it out and check it. It has draft wording across it. As you see here, when it's a draft, it's only when you tick the finalize button will this draft watermark come off, and then the document is locked and will be uneditable. There is also work that we've done in the background for the letter of agreement for small and low complexity projects. That's also available from Fresh Projects. It is free because we're dealing with small projects. It is a template document, Word template document with instructions how to fill it in and complete it. It is also available as guidance documents in the Compendium of Practice Guidelines. With that, there's also a guideline, a document, which is the standalone schedule of services that you can use to complete with that letter of agreement, but also can be used as a document to sit with a client and work through what is expected of you and what is expected of him in terms of providing services. Now, as always, if you do well and you do all this, you will all be happy. The client will shake your hand, he will smile at you, and he will pay what you're worth on time, and you have the backup that if he doesn't, then you can take the contract and have a disagreement with him, but the terms are there so that there's clear understanding and it gives you protection and the client protection. That was a lot. 20 minutes, sorry Eugene, probably just slightly over, but hopefully it's got a lot through. It's excited people, hopefully, and as I said, there's lots of presentations, workshops like these that will be coming out, communications on SAIA's website and also in their newsletter, and work with the region. So from a regional point of view, for instance, my work at PIA will also be doing presentations and launch events to get it out there that people can actually benefit from this document. There we go. I suppose questions now.
Yes, no, thank you, Colin. We've got just a few minutes to cover a few questions that have come in. But just once again, excellent job done. Thank you for the hard work on the agreement, and I really encourage our membership to use it. It's covered some bases. It's covered some aspects that weren't covered in the previous agreement. So thank you for that. The first question is a simple one. I hope you can answer it quite easily, Colin. It's as regards professional fees, what provision has been made for variation in the fee as the project develops? I noticed that the actual fee must be quoted up front.
Yeah, that's a good one. In terms of if it's final building cost, which is the traditional way of agreeing it, that is within those sort of terms as it is within the SAIAshare framework. In terms of the other formats, there are portions where you can actually define that. For instance, you could say the last invoice is to be confirmed. It doesn't have to be a fixed thing. And there is flexibility in the electronic version to do some of those facts, but also there are 4 or 5 different ways of calculating, allocating fees, depending on how you have agreed it and decided to work with your client. So hopefully there's sufficient there, but like anything, this will be a document work in progress, as you saw with the IDOW inclusion. So if users, as they get into it, find that there isn't sufficient allowance there, or they've come up with a different way of calculating fees, please let us know, and we will certainly consider it for adding into the next version.
Okay, great. But I can confirm, though, Kevin, that there is space in the agreement to actually record your fee proposal and how it's to be paid. So it's not cast in stone. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, Sydney, there's a question here. Projects designed and documented in 3D software. As a result, we have experienced that work stages are becoming more blended. Is this imperative? It is imperative that the work stages are aligned with the reality in practice?
That is a very interesting challenge, and it's a discussion we've got ongoing, as we bring in the sort of 3D world, particularly just the whole BIM management process into the agreement. The fee stage split section, if you're working on that basis, it highlights the guideline, but there's a section where you can decide what portion to put in where. BIM projects, as a lot of people know, there's more work up front, so you have a slightly higher skew. If things are right, your amount of work on site is less, so it's a lower fee, but then at the beginning or at stage 2 and 3, you can load the fee to cater for that fact. In terms of the blending of the services, what we've started is a process in the background of looking at the scope of services, the basic schedule, and combining the BIM components into the services specifically themselves, whereas at the moment we don't have that. But it's certainly something we need to concentrate on. It's always been a question of proxa, in people understanding that you may be doing in work stage 5 or work stage 4, but you're designing something that wasn't designed before. That's conceptual work. That is still stage 2 work, but it happens to be in stage 5. So there is a certain blending, particularly in fast track, and we are paying attention to that blend as we work up with the idea of BIM into the agreement.
Okay, Colin, thank you. And then an important question: when is the document available?
Now.
Right.
The version, those examples I gave you at the end of getting the document and stuff, that is a document I purchased earlier in the week. So go to freshprojects.co.za, go to the contracts tab, and you can follow the line. It is ready, available there for you now. And
Colin, it's quite easy to access.
Yeah,
it's not a complicated process.
It's not a complicated thing, but if you feel unsure and unstuck right at the beginning in one of the landing pages of the contract section, there are a couple of how-to videos that you can watch to get extra guidance.
Colin, just one sentence answer, if you can, on Mujahid's question. SAICAP has released a new CPPA with amended apportionment percentages. Has SAIA also? No, sorry, that's another question. What steps are taken to make sure that SAICAP fees are charged by professionals?
SAICAP fees are guidelines only. It is up to you as a professional and a director of a practice to determine your worth, work out what you, in terms of your business decisions, you feel you should be charging the client for the fee. The guideline is there to help you work through typical process of a project as to what it may involve in terms of fee, and also to demonstrate to your client. But the actual charging of that is a business case study by yourself, and then an agreement with your client.
Okay. Then I'm just going to conclude with the last question as well. Sorry, guys. Okay, just the cost of the agreement, maybe just.
Okay. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the value of the discount. But the full price, if you include VAT, is 552 Rand. So it's 480 something or whatever.
And then for SAIA members, that's discounted, further discounted.
For SAIA members, put in your login codes and stuff, and there is a discount there, and that goes to the SAIA pot stroke regional VA's pot to assist with the running of the institutes.
Okay. Okay. Then there's a question related to the agreement and how it may or may not relate to the medium and high complexity projects being loaded. Colin, yes, if I understand the objective of this agreement, it's not intended for those very complicated large projects.
No, it's not.
Okay,
the intent
Colin.
is the medium to smaller projects, because there are other more intricate suites of documents like the Proxa suite that have been structured and more specifically structured around the larger, more complex projects, more complex team structures.
Great. Colin, thank you very, very much.
It's a pleasure, as always.
And, you keep well. Then we're going to invite our sponsors to share 5 minutes with us. Please don't go away, because we're looking forward to the second presentation by Kevin Lloyd. It's going to be well worth your while to stay tuned. Okay.
Bonjour, mon nom est Philippe Stark. Je suis un explorateur de la vie, de nos vies. Je ne connais pas grand-chose parce que plus ou moins seul. Pourquoi? Parce que j'y suis seul. Seul pour réfléchir tranquille. Seul pour être sûr de pouvoir essayer d'avoir une idée originale, une idée personnelle. Donc voilà, ça c'est mon métier. Travailler avec du Ravit, c'est travailler avec la rigueur. Travailler à très long terme. Travailler pour la durabilité, pour la longévité, pour l'héritage. Ce sera le parfait dessin, sera la parfaite qualité. On cherche surtout à faire un bon produit. On ne cherche pas forcément à faire un beau produit, mais ce produit sera beau s'il est bon pour nous, s'il est bon pour vivre et s'il rend notre vie meilleure, notre vision, notre intelligence. Pourquoi la collection White Tulip? Le dessin est tulipé et il est blanc. Depuis toujours, j'ai dessiné des créations avec du Ravit, toujours extrêmement minimaliste. Mais au bout d'un moment, je me suis aperçu que cette perfection manquait peut-être d'un paramètre. Une sorte de sentiment, une sorte de nostalgie un peu positive, une sorte d'inscription dans le temps. J'ai voulu l'inscrire un petit peu dans le temps de la vie humaine. C'est-à-dire qu'au lieu de faire des collections totalement intemporelles, c'est-à-dire que les formes sont plus souples, on ne peut pas vraiment savoir. C'est un modèle ancien qui aurait été moderne. Un modèle moderne, mais qui a de la mémoire. On a choisi nature et culture parce que c'est un peu l'essence de du Ravit. C'est-à-dire que c'est des objets fabriqués avec une matière naturelle. La nature nous apporte la fraîcheur, l'honnêteté, la vérité, l'évidence. La culture, c'est notre rapport avec cet objet. White Tulip, Tulipe Blanche, est une collection à part et qui en fait manquait. Finalement, le secret de White Tulip, c'est que c'est un objet très luxueux, très sophistiqué, très juste en ergonomie. Mais avant tout, c'est un objet affectueux. C'est ça la différence. Maintenant, nous pouvons avoir de la tendresse. C'est pas mal, non ?
Very much for that, Derivat. Right, colleagues, now it's my privilege to introduce you to Kevin Lloyd. Kevin, if you would like to, please join me on video. Nevertheless, there we are. Been my privilege to know Kevin for many years, since 1974, if I'm not mistaken. And Kevin graduated from the University of Port Elizabeth, and he practiced for many years. And then in 1996, Kevin established Kevin Lloyd Architects. And he became involved as the architect for the team, for the Tongaat Hewlett team on Zimbali estate project. Now, Kevin has been involved in estate architecture for many, many years. I was astounded to see his resume. He specializes in residential homes, in residential estates. Kevin has been involved in the preparation of guidelines and the planning of 10 estates, monitoring estate architecture submissions in 12 different estates. He's designed and built a total of approximately 90 houses in estates. He's visited 13 estates internationally. That's in the USA, Australia, South America, Asia, and Africa. And has undertaken research on 15 local estates. So I personally have never come across anyone more qualified to speak on the subject of estate architecture, which Colin will be doing for us now. The topic of Colin's talk is estate escapades, the challenges to accept or push aside. So, Colin, thank you very, very much. We look forward with anticipation to all you're going to be sharing with us.
Hi, good afternoon, Eugene, colleagues. I hope you can all hear me. And Eugene, thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, it was a long time ago when we were studying together. Escapades, a challenge to accept or push aside. Estate architecture is often looked down upon by architects, primarily because a lot of it is very stylized. It's been driven to a great degree by estate agents and developers. So, you know, do we step aside from this and try to do work in other fields and be sort of more creative or more individualistic? Or do we actually get involved, and getting involved actually try to produce better architecture in the States? I personally believe in the latter. And what I'd like to do now is take you through just my experience of the research that I did, the travels that I did, and then my experience in Zimbabwe, and maybe just afterwards some pictures of some projects that have been done, and what I think and how I think we should perhaps move forward. Right. So first of all, in 2007, I kind of began this process of evaluating estate architecture when I was the guest editor of the KZNIA magazine. The magazine was, as editor, what I actually did was to invite a number of architects in the province who were working in estates and ask them to present their projects and to comment on their experiences in those estates, and you know what they believe could be done to improve it. These estates, I mean, it was from Zululand all the way down to the south coast. So with my travels, the many travels that I'd done before I got involved in Zimbabwe, for me, the most inspirational of all the estates was SAIAshare. I was fortunate enough to actually stay 2 nights in the one of the little walk-up cabins done by Obi Bowman, and also to visit his studio and to talk to him about his experience in the estates. He'd done a number of houses in the estate. So as you can see, SAIAshare, it's a very big estate of over 1,000 units. It was started in the 1960s, a utopian period when it was believed that architecture and town planning was the way to improve everyone's life. I still believe that, although I'm not sure that we are held in the same esteem that we used to be. This area was very much, it was originally sheep farming area, and the buildings that were there were farm buildings, done in the shapes and forms of them were very much as a result of the weather and the climate, and the materials used were materials that are sourced in the area, being cedar, which is left to go grey, so you have cedar shingles and cedar boarding. As you can see, it was a very large estate divided up into sections, and you can notice that some of the areas, contrary to what very often would happen with developers where they would line everything up in a row to get maximum sea view, these actually ran at 90 degrees to the coast, and a lot of that had to do with dealing with the weather conditions. So there were a number of well-known architects, planners and landscapers who were involved in SAIAshare, and So they developed the guidelines, and then subsequent to this, they were involved in a number of buildings on the estate and helped to establish the estate for its status that it held for a long time and still holds. You can see here the shape of the building and also the color, how it blends in with the building, with the architecture that's there. Similarly, an individual house. Now, interestingly enough, there was no style here. It was purely material, dealing with the weather, and you basically could develop your own form and shape. And this was a house done by O.B. Bowman, and actually you have a planted roof. And also a partially an organic shape. There were other houses that also had organic forms and shapes to them. One of them being actually the chapel on the estate. You can see here the various different forms and shapes which were used, and this was a self-guided architectural design tour. Explains the design guidelines. One thing that was interesting about SAIAshare was that the state of California had also introduced a law that required you, if you were an estate developer, to have social housing on your estate. This is way back in the 60s. So what it actually entailed, that the developer would build houses for in the same idiom as the estate, and this would be both for the construction workers as well as the workers who continue to work on the estate afterwards. What actually transpired was that the workers actually realized that they could sell their units and make a substantial profit and live in an area that was more akin to their sort of lifestyle. So we move then to the next estate. The next estate is now the direct opposite to SAIAshare. This was more urbanism. This is Seaside. Seaside being an example of a modern interpretation of a typical American seaside village holiday resort. One of the other examples of estates that I visited is where you find resort hotels are on large pieces of land, and what they do is they set aside sections of that property for individual homeowners to build their houses. Now, the idea here is that the homeowner will build his house. He possibly would want to let it out when he's not there, so as to improve the financial feasibility of his house, and the hotel would manage it. And likewise, when he was there on holiday, he would have the ability to use the hotel's facilities. So what happens is that the architecture of the hotel then sets the goals or the standards or the guidelines for the houses. Now, this is taken from a brochure that I collected there. This is Amangani, which is Jackson Hole in Wyoming. And you can see here what was envisaged to be the eventual product. When I was there, there were a few houses that had been built. It had never reached this stage. So my next trip was to Chile, and with the help of a local architect, they took me to an estate where 10 prominent architects had been invited to design contemporary architecture, and in doing so, hopefully set an example and a guide for future clients who wanted to have houses on the estate and also employ their architects. Now we move to examples in South Africa where one has a developer who either is an architect, related to an architect, or is passionate about architecture. And this definitely helps the architect involved to move a step up, because there's a far greater understanding of what architecture is about and what the environment is about. So this is an example of Monaghan Farm, and which is very much focused on being able to build within the environment, to be as to hide as much as possible into the environment and to be part of the felt. The next one is similarly, this is Dunkirk on the Ballito coast. It's a small estate, it's a forest estate. It's an estate whose guidelines were not stylized, but very much about materials, form, and integration into the environment. The developer, sorry, was passionate about architecture and still is with his developments that he is doing. And he engaged the services of a very well-known practice. And this practice undertook the gatehouse, the sales center, admin center, and the clubhouse social facilities. And as a result of this architecture that was done, which was there was no link to any style or anything, there are approximately 10 architects who actually reside currently in this estate and who actually design their own homes. And there are very few estates where I think you will find that number of architects actually living in that estate and having done their own individual homes. Lastly, we have Marina de Gama, also in the mid-60s, early 70s. Now, this was a modern interpretation of local traditional architecture. It was very large. And what can be learnt out of this is that one has to realize that estates develop over a very long period, depending on their size, but even small estates can take a long time before they are completed. So here, I mean, I think about 20 years on from when it started, we experienced political and financial issues in this country and worldwide. And the architectural goals of what were originally set had to be slightly watered down. And I think what was in a magnificent estate initially kind of fell foul of things that are outside of a developer's control. So we moved to Zimbabwe. Okay, so many people think that Zimbabwe is all about Balinese. Yes, it did become that way, but in actual fact, the name means place of flowers in Zulu. And the initial guidelines and the initial intention in the coastal forest section, this is an estate of over 1,000 units. It is divided into phases. So the initial phase, I was involved in the architects and part of a very large team of landscapers, golf course architects, town planners, engineers, local authority, all sorts of specialists. So what if we proceed to what Zimbabwe was before it started development? It basically was a forest, a coastal forest. Yes, it did have a lot of casuarinas on it, which were later removed and replaced with indigenous trees. But this is where the actual architecture came from. And having gone around on the estate, taken photographs, there were a whole lot more, but this photograph here basically stood out as what was going to be used as to establish the guidelines and to look to find something that one could attach the architecture to. So we started doing sketches and sketch plans and looking at how houses could be built there, possibly the elements that could be used in the houses as a guide, to develop something that could be used in the marketing and could actually begin to guide towards an architecture that would be established there. So this went one step further when we built the initial sales office and admin office. So we took those elements and then introduced them and used them in various different parts of the building, and hopefully then that the marketing people could see this and use this as part of the marketing tool. And to assist in this, sorry, wrong way, there were also a number of different posters done where the idea of the tree and the branches and the actual structure thereof could then be interpreted and put into place into the different elements of the architecture. But a hotelier got involved, and as most developers will know, something like this to kickstart your estate helps you on your way, and it definitely is often needed in estates because to get that your project going is often difficult. So here we have the Zimbali, the render for the Zimbali Lodge, and we were influenced and asked to go and look at what were then the leaders in boutique hotels, the Aman Group in Bali, and as such, the Zimbali Lodge morphed a bit towards a Balinese style. And from then on, the architecture on the estate started to go that way, and the name started to actually stick to it. And at the same time, funny enough, Balinese decor and everything became very fashionable in decor and all sorts. So next, adjacent, the coastal forest part of the estate was what was the golf course estate. The golf course estate had very little trees on it. It was purely sugarcane. And the buildings were a lot more visible and a lot more dominant on the golf course. So as the roof was the dominant element in this coastal forest, so here we looked at the type of architecture where the first floor could be in the roof, and the architecture also had to somehow or other tie in to what had gone before. Consequently, we kind of looked for inspiration in the arts and crafts movement, and this is kind of what we set out in a whole lot of sketches, etc., to use at the meetings with the architects. Unfortunately, there were some buildings that were done using this sort of these guidelines and this this idiom. However, the Balinese tended to carry on and drive forward. So now we go to the process that we followed. So excuse me, using aerial photographs, we established where trees were, sort of rough positions. Sorry, excuse me. And footprints were established based on this. The footprints were flexible so that they could be adjusted when you actually did the survey of your site. But in saying that, the size could not be increased, and one had to take into account your neighbor privacy as well as view. So so from here, we moved to looking at individual sites and did more detailed house layouts and designs. Excuse me. From there, we then, in my practice at the time, throughout the country, there were 10 young architects, and we asked these architects to look at the guidelines and to design a concept house. So each one, based in a different part of the country, actually then designed a house on a different site, so we could examine how well the guidelines would work for people who actually weren't familiar with the coastal coastal sort of architecture. So now we move from there, we move on to the actual process of presenting to the committee. So we had an architectural committee that consisted of 2 architects, a chairman, who actually also turned out to be an architect, but in the employment of Tongot Hewlett. We had the local authority, the landscape architect, representatives from the directors of the homeowners association, or the developer. So what happened, I think this was something that we learned and introduced from Sea Ranch. The very first meeting was with the estate agent, the owner, the architect, and the committee. And this was very relaxed discussion. It was that we could see what the estate agent had actually sold the client, and that going forward, the estate agent also could understand better what we were actually looking for. Also that the client had briefed the architect correctly, and that the architect had understood his brief correctly. And so, as I said, it was very relaxed. From there, the next meeting was the architect and the committee. And at this meeting, we looked at site analysis, concepts, very much sketches, discussions, showing other examples, even to an extent of saying, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? Or I can't do this. What about doing this from the architect? So that's how we kind of progressed. The next stage was the formal sketch plan, which was a CAD drawing or could have been a hand drawing to scale. Elevation sections plans, 3-dimensional drawings. The 3-dimensional drawings, what is I think very important here, and it's something that I have an issue with. What happens now very often in the States is we have very fancy 3D drawings with renders, all sorts of furniture, people, plants, and my term for it is architectural pornography. I honestly think we're hiding what we should really be looking at is the architecture. And in Zimbabwe, that's what we tried to do. We wanted to see what the architecture was. We didn't want to see what the decor and the landscaping was. And then the following meeting would be the LA drawing submission. We would simply check to see that the LA drawings complied with the sketch plans. The technical aspects, town planning, were dealt with by the estate officials, technical officials. So now we have architects who've come along, we've got the guidelines, and what we tried to do was to encourage architects to look at the guidelines, to look at how, for their client, how they could adapt these, how they could also put their own stamp onto it, and even interpret the guidelines in a unique way. And we would support them where we believed that this was in the interest of the estate And we honestly did. We tried in phase one in the coastal forest section, and to an extent in the golf course, was to look at ways to how an estate can grow. Because one must remember, very often, if you have stylized guidelines, they're only really applicable for the time that style is fashionable. Once that goes, colors change, the decor changes, often spaces changes, materials change, and all of those things. One actually, when one does the initial house, one needs to take that into consideration, because your client is not going to live here just for 5 years. He's going to live here 15, 20 years or whatever. So what I'm going to show you is a number of examples where the boundaries were pushed a little, or where the architecture was slightly different to what might have been the normal sort of tendency. So the first one is in is in Zimbabwe, where traditionally houses were positioned in the center of the site. Here, what we did was we positioned the house on the edge of the footprint. Secondly, the second roof, which was normally Zimbabwe required 2 roof pitches, and the second roof was the overhang. So what we did was, yes, it was the overhang, but on the first floor, it was actually a bay window. And that provided the overhang to the floor below. And also, by doing this, we were able to open up completely the glass at the bottom, so that from the courtyard, you actually could look through and see the sea. Using golf course architecture, one was allowed to have gables, and again, you will see gables in this example. An example in Hawan, where the Hawan estate, which is close to Umhlanga, where we wanted large oversailing slabs, and because there were coverage controls, by inserting holes in the roof like this, we were able to avoid the coverage rule, and while still being able to have the large oversailing roof and horizontal slabs that we were looking for. Likewise, in Brettonwood, an estate in Belito, it was designed, the guidelines were to be in the ethos and the philosophy of Frank Lloyd Wright. What had happened was, we did have a developer who was rather conservative, and we tended to land up with a lot of pitched roofs and grey concrete roof tiles. We pushed the boundary, and we managed to show that in Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy, these sort of roofs and forms had taken place. And so we did this house, and subsequent to that, there are a number of other flat roofed houses that have actually developed. Back to Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, this is the Valley of the Pools. So the coastal forest had developed the golf course architecture. A golf course section had also developed, and they'd moved across to the western area, and flat roof, a lot more concrete boxes, flat roof architecture become more the sort of style. And as a result of that, what we did was we tried to show how we could introduce elements such as cantilevered pergolas, and also walls punctured with holes where children could sit in, or you could see the planting beyond it. Again, the Zimbabwe office park, the second roof slope was now boarded roofing, with stone chips on top and steel structural elements. Again, trying to take Zimbali into a more contemporary style or more contemporary architecture. Back to Hawan, the house on the left here, this was the spine that ran through and tied the house together. In order to do that, we needed some height, but to get height, the only way you could do that above the rest of the roofs was you had to have chimneys. So incorporated into this right along its entire length are 5 chimney stacks, which were actually used. Cotswold Downs, an estate in the west of Durban. Again, if you did have ancillary buildings, they had to be linked to the existing home. And what we did here was we entered across, the entrance is on the top here, we entered across the top to the front door. Below was the kitchen, and there was a staircase within the garage area which took you up to the garage and further up into the ancillary unit, and thereby allowing us to have these 2 very simple forms but yet linked, and that the client could achieve the brief and the accommodation that they were looking for. And lastly, to Zimbali. Zimbali, as those of you who may have visited it know, the golf clubhouse has the old ruin of what was the original farmhouse. Well, this site here, where we wanted to keep as many of the trees and integrate the building into that site, also had adjoining it and partially into our site the old milking sheds ruins. And those milking shed ruins were in an old red face brick, and you had the fig tree roots all over it. And what we did, and unfortunately I didn't have pictures as good as this of it, but various areas and facades within the building or planes, we actually reintroduced that red brick. It took some debating and some arguing to convince people why we were introducing the red brick, and it purely wasn't just repeating a Mount Edgecombe red brick again. So this is what I'm saying, where one pushes the boundaries, because that's how one can make sure that the guidelines stay relevant, and how one can also ensure that they don't become stagnant, and they are able to live and move forward in time with the owner of the house. Look, there are a whole lot of more samples and examples I could show you, and I could discuss a whole lot more with you. Unfortunately, time restricts us, but I hope this presentation has helped you to understand there is potential in the States. Go for it. Let's make them better architecture rather than avoid them. Thank you.
Right, colleagues, Kevin, thank you very, very much. That was fascinating and stimulating, and that's exactly what SAIAshare is all about. It's sharing our knowledge, our experience, our expertise with one another. And may I say that you and Colin have not disappointed us. We really appreciate your input. Right then, colleagues, I need to move on. And thank you, thanking Duravit on your behalf for sponsoring this program and for the next 2 programs. We really appreciate our sponsors, and we do commend them to you. We do not bring sponsors on board who we don't feel comfortable with. So thank you, Angelique. Then, as far as CPD certificates, category 3 certificates are concerned, please read the slide. You can download your CPD certificates. Then to view SAIAshare events, this is event number 5. To view any of the previous 4 events, there's a link for you on the ECPD Pro portal, and you can find the link as well on SAIA.org. You can register for the next event, which takes place on the 1st of October. That's the first Friday afternoon of October. And we'd love to see you. Thank you so much for attending this event. It's because of you that we can carry on. If you don't support the event, I'm afraid it's just not going to happen. But please keep it up, and you're welcome to invite your colleagues and your friends to attend. We have an exciting program lined up for you on the 1st of October. I'd like to just briefly introduce you to our 2 speakers. They are all-male cast. On the 1st of October, you're going to have a colourful all-female cast. Heather Dodd is going to join us. She's a partner in the practice Savage and Dodd Architects. She needs little introduction. Heather has a particular interest in social housing and urban regeneration, and has been involved in many large-scale housing projects, contributing to the revitalization of the inner city of Johannesburg. And Savage and Dodd, her practice has been the recipient of several awards, design awards, as you probably know. Heather's topic is going to be housing stories, adapting and repurposing the city. It's such a relevant topic, and you should not want to miss this one. Our next speaker is a young architect from Mpumalanga by the name of Janri Lemmer. From Mpumalanga, one of the most beautiful parts of our country, and over the past month or 2, it would have been one of the warmest parts of our country. From an early age, Janri found the magnificent, diverse, natural landscape of the country to be the source of serenity and joy, and she will be sharing with us on the topic of staying grounded and exploration into the opportunities the diverse natural landscape of South Africa has to offer the architectural field. So, colleagues, once again, thank you very much for your attendance. We wish you a very pleasant weekend. And until we meet again on the 1st of October, keep well and keep safe. And then we see you in a month's time.